Is preventing heart disease more than just lowering your cholesterol? Nearly 700,000 Americans die every year from heart disease, and it is still the leading cause of death, despite a major push by mainstream medicine to increase statins and other cholesterol-lowering medications. So the question becomes, what are we missing? How many of these small and dense type of LDL particles do we have? What are what we call oxidized LDL? These are the ones that basically are resulting from an inflammatory response.
The Neuronutrition Podcast is sponsored by North Florida Spine and Wellness and produced by Juming Delmas Studios.
Welcome to another episode of the Neuronutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Z, and today I'm going to walk you through a functional root cause approach to cardiovascular health, looking at inflammation, insulin resistance, vascular health, even how your genetics influence your heart disease risk, and all the advanced testing and different natural treatments you can do to help optimize your heart health. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at Neuronutrition Podcast, and let's get started with the show. So heart disease has been the number one killer of Americans, like I've already mentioned, for a long time. But this isn't just older Americans. What's really alarming is that even Americans age 18 to 44 have seen a 66% increase in heart attacks since just 2019. Now, up to this point, from a medical model, we really have just looked at, really just one major factor, and that is cholesterol. However, what we're seeing is that this strategy is not necessarily causing a real decrease in these cardiovascular events. Cholesterol is, an issue, a topic that is a lot more complicated than we're led on to believe. So when we look at cholesterol, typically we're going to be focusing on something called LDL. That is your quote-unquote bad cholesterol. The problem is 50% of people who have heart attacks, they have it with normal cholesterol, normal LDL. And really, cholesterol is supposed to be more of a repair molecule. It's something that actually helps repair some sort of inflammatory insult. So really, when we look at just LDL, while there can be some genetic influences that can cause you to create more cholesterol than, especially more bad cholesterol than other individuals, it in of itself is not inherently bad. In fact, LDL itself has many different forms, and they come in different sizes and different densities. So typically, when we look at LDL from a cardiovascular risk point, we're going to be more focused on, we want to be able to know and be focused on how many of these small and dense type of LDL particles do we have? What are what we call oxidized LDL? These are the ones that basically are resulting from an inflammatory response. And that's something that we're going to kind of hit home today, is that really inflammation is going to be more at a root cause to create some of this plaquing in our arteries that creates this cardiovascular risk. So going back to LDL, again, you got these small and dense ones, you got these big fluffy ones. The big fluffy ones really do not have any cardiovascular risk factor to them. So a lot of people can have if you have a LDL number, let's say of 150 or 160, that's going to look pretty high to most doctors. However, if we break those lipids down, and this can be done in routine blood testing, we can look at those particle sizes and say, hey, we don't have too many of these small, dense ones, but we have a lot of big, fluffy ones. This is a person who probably doesn't have much of a cardiovascular risk profile based off just those cholesterol numbers. And cholesterol is used in the body for other things. LDL cholesterol is actually utilized by our bodies to make hormones. So just sucking all of that cholesterol out, I mean, I've seen this with some of my patients where the goal of their physician is to get that LDL almost basically to zero. They could, if they could, they would get it to zero. But I don't think that that is necessarily going to create an overall healthy individual, because this molecule in our body does have some very important functions. So let's talk a little bit more about that kind of root cause that I mentioned in the form of inflammation. So when we think about how arteries plaque and clog, is some of the common terminology that people tend to know out there. I think a lot of us get this idea that this plaque just is kind of sticky and then it's going to stick to the inside of our arteries. And as it sticks and builds up over time, that's when we create basically this plaque, this narrowing of the arteries that can lead to cardiovascular events, strokes, heart attacks, those different types of things. But that's not really what's happening. The arteries actually clog more from the inside out. It takes an inflammatory response to create damage. And we're going to talk more about that lining of those arteries, the endothelium, here in a little bit. But you have to have damage to that endothelium, that lining. And then what happens in an attempt to repair that injury, that inflammatory response, you have cholesterol come in there and it's going to start to penetrate that endothelium lining of where that inflammatory event happened, and that starts to create that plaquing, and it actually it builds it out and creates that narrowing kind of from the inside out. So it's kind of inside of that arterial lining. Why that's important is because theoretically, without any kind of inflammation, that LDL is not going to penetrate or plaque anybody in that situation. So there are some really good lab markers that you can be looking for to measure if you are having some sort of inflammation that's specifically going to impact cardiovascular risk. So my favorite one to do, and I run it on every single patient, is going to be high sensitivity C-reactive protein. That is very specific for heart-based inflammation. It's a good measure for just, frankly, systemic inflammation throughout your body. For instance, when you get sick, your C-reactive protein is going to go up just from the natural immune response. So that's always important to know too. So if you go have this test done, you just came off the flu last week, and your C-reactive protein is through the roof, well, that might be normal. We might want to recheck that in a couple of months to make sure that to see if that was just a result of fighting off some sort of virus, or is that really a more longer-term inflammatory response that's happening in your body? Another inflammatory marker that I like to utilize a lot is called homocysteine. Now, this one has a little bit more to do with your genetics. For a lot of people who have heard about MTHFR, for instance, which is specifically related to how we process folate in our body. This also can link into different B12 and some other B vitamins. Also what we call a whole cycle called methylation, which we've discussed at some in the past, but essentially it's how we turn on and off our genes from a chemical process. But if that cycle is not going correctly, there is a compound called homocysteine that will not be broken down when that cycle is disrupted. And when it gets elevated, it is actually known to inflame our endothelium. It can create inflammation in our brain as well, but it is very specific for creating inflammatory response on our arteries. And what's cool about that is when that's elevated, that's a relatively easy thing to do. Doing bioavailable B vitamins, especially when we can link it up specific to your genetics, will almost always lower that homocysteine level. So that is something that I think is very important to be testing on a routine basis. Another marker is fibrinogen. Fibrinogen is a inflammatory marker that links to clotting formation. So if you have high fibrinogen, you're more likely to create clots, for instance. So that can be a very good marker to know what to do with that. You can also, when we talk about LDL, we might want to look at oxidized LDL. Okay, these are LDL particles that have been oxidized, which tells us that these are ones that are going through an inflammatory response. So that leads us into another topic of, well, what causes that? What allows inflammation specific to cardiovascular risk to happen? Well, probably the most important thing, and this is a common theme throughout our show when we talk about people, or even in our office when we're getting people to improve their health, it's lifestyle. That is the most important factor that we have under control. So if we get insulin resistance, we get pre-diabetic, okay, that blood sugar handling problem will create inflammatory responses throughout our body. Some of us are a little bit more genetically prone to higher blood sugar, so that's something that we want to keep in mind as well. But Point being is eating a healthy diet, getting plenty of protein. I am more of a fan of high protein, moderate fat, lower carbohydrate type of diet. But the big thing is eat real food. That is the most simple change that almost every American, I believe, can make, is start making a process of switching from processed foods to more whole foods. Eat real food. And that alone will show an improvement in your health just by doing that alone. But this is, one thing we can control. There are other things. There's environmental toxins. There's research that show certain chemicals in our environment, heavy metals in particular in our environment, can create this inflammatory response. We can have infections that create inflammatory responses. This is why actually listening to your dentist and creating healthy gums and teeth is actually helpful. There is research that show bacteria from our gums, for instance, can get into our system and travel and create inflammatory responses to our heart as well. So these are other factors that we have, a little bit less control of than just our lifestyle. But of course, the other thing we want to make sure we're doing is regular movement and exercise. That is, again, going into those lifestyle habits, but not just doing cardiovascular, cardio type of exercise. Resistance training is also very, very important to creating, actually lowering blood sugar. In fact, resistance training is probably is definitely the most effective exercise technique to lower your insulin resistance and your blood sugar levels. So don't forget to lift a little bit of weight. Like as I always tell my patients, my female patients, we don't need you to become Arnold Schwarzenegger, but we do need some resistance training to optimize health. Just cardiovascular type of exercise alone is not always the best way to go. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the factors that we talked about create this cardiovascular risk. And one I kind of mentioned a little bit when I was talking about homocysteine is that endothelium. That's that lining of the arteries. And this can be disrupted not just by inflammation and the blood sugar and different things that I mentioned there, but this is also when we talk about poor sleep, stress. There are some very physical ways that we can measure how stress creates bad health and actually can kill you. Cortisol release can create this chronic inflammatory response because that is your stress hormone that gets released during times of stress. Poor sleep habits, smoking, again, that goes back to the toxins, can disrupt that. And then, of course, just plain nutritional deficiencies. I talked about even if we don't have genetics that affect how we metabolize B vitamins, if we're deficient in B vitamins, just that alone can create that homocysteine level to come up and create some of that endothelium dysregulation. So again, a lot of this comes down to, and I think this is actually really empowering for a lot of our listeners, is that you control a lot of this through proper lifestyle. You don't necessarily, there are going to be some genetics that we talk about here in a little bit that definitely work against people, but there are some really, really great things you can do just by eating better, exercising regularly, getting good sleep, working on good sleep habits, monitoring and trying to manage stress as well as we can. And look, I know for some of you are saying like, there's no way I can get stress out of my life, and most of us can. And I'm frankly one of those individuals where stress plays a major, major role in a health challenge for a lot of people who necessarily just can't walk away from that stress. But there are things you can do. Vagus nerve stimulation, for instance. So we've talked a lot about the vagus nerve on this podcast. But doing vagus nerve stimulation helps regulate that fight and flight response, can help lower and modulate cortisol. And, there's a lot of cool fancy equipment you can do to help stimulate your vagus nerve, but you can also do things like deep breathing, gargling. There's vibration up at the roof of your mouth you can do. You can do temperature changes, much like you would do in a cold plunge type of situation. Humming and singing also stimulate the vagus nerve. So there are some regular routine exercises you can do to initiate that vagus nerve. And what was also cool about it, it will, especially when done regularly, it can help you be more resilient to the stress in your everyday life. So just think, because, hey, I have this, terrible stress in my life and I'm never going to get rid of it. Don't just be a victim to that. There are ways to fight back. It's not going to be as perfect as if you could just wipe away that stress, of course, but doing nothing is the worst thing that you can do. Okay, so let's take a minute to talk about the genetics of cardiovascular disease. Now, there certainly is genetic weaknesses where certain individuals, and you'll see this as in a familial line very commonly, where some people just produce a lot of cholesterol genetically. So some of those individuals, it's not uncommon for some of those individuals to have a total cholesterol well over 300, for instance. They might have LDL over that bad cholesterol over 200, for instance. And sometimes they'll have good HDL, which is your good cholesterol, which we haven't even really discussed about too much, but that will tend to outweigh some of the risk from the LDL because it helps ship away some of that bad cholesterol. But when we talk about these individuals, that high LDL alone from a genetic history is just one piece of the picture again. So there are some other genetic markers like ApoE, which is going to be how you process saturated fats. Now, saturated fats are kind of a controversial issue. Some people will argue that saturated fats can, foods with saturated fats can be healthy. Probably the best example out there is things like coconut oil. Coconut oil, for some people, is heralded as a superfood, which it does have a lot of other things in coconut oil that is beneficial that I do like. However, if you're someone with a saturated fat sensitivity, coconut oil is probably not a great choice for you because you are more likely for that to poorly affect your lipid profile. So that's kind of a nuanced thing. And when I say people who say coconut oil is bad and some people say coconut oil is great, my answer to that question is, well, they're both right. It just really depends on the individual. And I think that comes back to a broader discussion on how we fail in medicine by not taking the nuance of the individual into account when we're talking about recommendations. And look, that's a tricky thing. We try to make simple global recommendations for the general population, but we at least need to be honest and transparent with our patients that those are general guidelines, but for the individual, it's going to look different. So that is a great example for that. Another kind of underrated genetic marker that we could look at is FADS1 and 2. That's FADS. And that relates to how we process different omega fatty acids. So when we think of cardiovascular health, probably a lot of you are well of omega-3 fatty acids in fish oil, for instance. And there has been probably in the last 10 years some controversy even with omega-3s, which probably could be its own podcast in of itself, talking about that whole controversy. But when we look at the overall evidence here, there is pretty clear evidence that omega-3s and having good omega-3 profiles. So these are tests that we can run to basically break down your omega-3s compared to your omega-6s. Omega-6s, while necessary, do tend to be a little inflammatory, and that is one result of this processed food diet that we've had. We have a incredibly higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio that we do now than we did ancestrally back centuries ago when we didn't have so much cardiovascular disease issues. So we look at these FADS1 and FADS2 genetic markers. Essentially, what we're going to be looking at is omega-6 and omega-3. Omega-6 is something we see a lot in seed oils, and seed oils are something that have been widely talked about with new health recommendations that have come out from the federal government. But when we look at these genetic markers, for some of us, we are going to be more sensitive to those omega 6s. That means those omega 6s can be more inflammatory and thus more dangerous from a cardiovascular perspective. So, knowing that, again, that comes with, I think a little bit of canola oil in of itself is probably not a big deal for most individuals. But for certain individuals with that omega 6 sensitivity, I'm going to say absolutely we need to stay away from canola oil. We need to be more alongside the lines of olive oil. And that's, if you wanted to ask me one oil that I think everyone can use and use safely, it's going to be olive oil. Now, olive oil, of course, the kind of issue there is that it does have a lower smoke point, so you can't cook on higher heats with olive oil. And so typically for most individuals, if I was going to give a kind of a broad spectrum recommendation, I tend to go more towards olive oil and then avocado oil for more of that high heat type of cooking. But if you have those genes definitely into your testing routine for cardiovascular health, we're going to be wanting to look at those essential fatty acids. What's our omega-6 to omega-3 ratio? What's our omega-3 index? What's the percentage of omega-3s? There's been studies showing that if we get that level up above 8%, we can see up to a 90% reduction in sudden cardiovascular death. So to me, that is a no-brainer to add into the mix. So as far from a genetic perspective, just saying, oh yeah, high cholesterol runs in my family, I have that genetic disorder. That, again, is just one small piece of the picture. And we can also look at other things in our genes that look towards, do we tend towards more oxidative stress, which just means, do we tend towards more inflammatory response in our body? Some people need more antioxidants, for instance, in that case. And that comes down to the basic tenet of inflammation being kind of underlying all this. So again, take-home message there is that genetics can be looked at in a much more complex way, and that's something we do every day in our office to really get a bigger picture of that cardiovascular risk profile. So let's talk about testing. If we wanted to say, hey, I have a high family history of heart disease, I want to be proactive about preventing heart disease, what test should I run on a routine basis? And to me, there is a great group of labs that you can do to give us a real clear profile. Because typically, when you go to your primary care and they run your blood test, they're basically just going to look at cholesterol in the context of cardiovascular risk. But let's talk about what we can look to give a bigger picture. So first of all, let's just talk about cholesterol. Let's think about running something called NMR, which is basically a breakdown of all of your cholesterol into what we call particle size. So again, like we mentioned at the beginning of the show, those small, dense LDL particles are the most dangerous, and the big fluffy ones tend to not have that cardiovascular risk. And depending on your overall pattern, this could be up to, you could have the exact same amount of LDL as somebody else, but you might have a 2 times increase, so a 200% increase in risk because you have more of those small, dangerous LDL. Guess what? The big thing about statin medications in particular is those cholesterol-lowering medications don't change the particle size. They just lower the overall amount. So they don't necessarily change the overall lipid panel or lipid profile, excuse me. So that is a very, very important test that I would like to run on everybody. We already kind of mentioned some of this as well, but C-reactive protein, the high sensitivity for inflammation, that homocysteine, fibrinogen are all very good markers. There's another marker called LP-PLA2, which can be good for stroke risk and the potential of breaking off a clot to create a stroke, for instance, is a good measurement as well. Some other tests I love to do are those omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid balance. That is a great test. There's also some tests you can dig more into the risk of, hey, is that LDL? Okay, let's say, okay, my particle size isn't that bad. My LDL, I'm not sure if it's a problem or not. You can even dig deeper in there and run things like lipoprotein A. So apolipoprotein A is actually an independent risk factor. Now, the challenge with LPA is it is 90% genetic. So this, again, if you have that genetic family history, this is a no-brainer. Everybody with that genetic-based high cholesterol should be running this test to see what their level of LPA is. Now, there are some things that can bring that LPA down. We've actually done that. There's certain nutrients that we use that can help that. But the most effective thing, again, is going to be those lifestyle interventions that we do. Healthy diet and exercise are going to be extremely important to managing LPA because it has such a strong genetic impact. The other one is apolipoprotein B, which is basically a total measurement of all of your plaque-forming lipids. So these are all the lipids there that are, more potentially going to create plaquing within the arteries. So these are kind of my first line of defense type of interventions as far as lab testing to try to get ahead of some of these things. But there are also, the medications that are out there. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people, I think the juice is worth the squeeze to have some of these medications in there, especially if you've had a previous cardiovascular event. That's a very important nuanced term when you really dig into the data as far as a primary prevention. And what I mean by that, let's say you've had no cardiovascular event in your life and taking things like statin drugs do not have a very good track record of preventing that first cardiovascular event. They show much better data after someone's already had a cardiovascular event, okay? So that's an important nuance to know. But if you have a lot of these risk factors, there are some more natural nutrients and herbals that you can use to lower these numbers pretty much across the board, of course, in conjunction with those lifestyle interventions. So let's talk about cholesterol first in general. And, again, I've said this on pretty much every show. I've made some recommendations as far as supplementation. Make sure, because, a lot of people who may be interested in doing some of this stuff, you may be already on some medications. You might be on a blood thinner in particular that would change the recommendation. So, again, always make sure you're working with a physician before you just go out there and throw some stuff up against the wall. So, red yeast rice is one of the first nutrients you'll hear me talk about. It works as far as a chemical process, pretty much like a statin does. Okay, so it will lower your cholesterol. The downside of it is in certain high doses, some people can have some of that fatigue and muscle achiness, just like they do with statin drugs. Now, I don't find that side effect to be nearly as prevalent with red yeast rice because used with conjunction, when you layer it on with different synergistic herbs and compounds, you don't need as much red yeast rice, frankly. And when you do that, then you can have the desirable effect on the labs without the side effects. And that brings me into something you should take, whether you're doing red yeast rice or you are on some sort of statin medication, CoQ10. I'm always going to have somebody on about 200 milligrams of CoQ10, at least with, especially if we have a red yeast rice product in there. But if you are on a statin medication, or perhaps for some people recovering from a cardiovascular event, we may tend to go more towards 400 milligrams in those individuals. So that's important both ways around. Berberine is also one of my favorite herbs to utilize. Berberine is an herb that can not only help you with insulin resistance, help you lower blood sugar levels, but it also is shown to lower LDL and does have some semblance of evidence that perhaps it even helps change that particle size balance as well. So that's a really cool thing to do. You can also use things like plant sterols. Aged garlic is also, I find, to be very effective, especially when you combine them together, is what we typically do in our office. Another thing you can do, again, when we have things like homocysteine that are elevated, homocysteine is going to respond really good to methylized B vitamins. There's some nuance to that. Some people are going to need some other methyl donors. SAMe is in particular one of those. But also, you may be sensitive to certain methyl donors, so there can be things like different forms of B12 and folate that we might utilize in those cases. But that's, a smaller chunk of the population. But having bioavailable B vitamins will help with that homocysteine level. The next thing we want to talk about as far as supplementation might be if you have like a high fibrinogen level. Do you tend towards clotting? There can be really good proteolytic enzymes that we use. This, in particular, nattokinase is one of my favorite to help lower that fibrinogen level that can lower that clotting risk factor as well. And then finally, you have some of your more common supplementation that you would think of. Vitamin E is a very good antioxidant, so that can be good if you have some of that inflammatory stress that is there. There's some markers are elevated there. Vitamin E is great. Of course, general antioxidants, NAC, which is N-acetylcysteine, helps you produce our most powerful antioxidant, glutathione. That can be really helpful. For some people, things like green tea extract, turmeric, resveratrol can all be very effective to help with those situations as well. And then, of course, omega-3s. Omega-3, my main recommendations for the dosage on that, it's going to vary. And honestly, I tend to try to gear that based off of your omega-3 level. So, just like with when we talk about vitamin D, which, I would throw vitamin D as something in here that also is very important with cardiovascular health as well, just because of how it modulates inflammation. But, for someone who's, maybe at when the bottom level is 30 on vitamin D, if they're at 10, I'm gonna give them a higher dose if they're 35, and I just want to get their level up a little bit. Omega-3s are going to be the same way. There's two forms of omega-3, or two main forms of omega-3 that you'll want to keep your eye out for. It's EPA and DHA. DHA is going to be more brain and your eyes. EPA, just think of that more as inflammation. For most people, I tend to be going towards higher levels of EPA in those omega-3s, but that's not always the case. Again, we might see people who, their EPA level, when we break down those fatty acids, aren't so bad, and so we might actually need more DHA. But having that ideal omega-3 level, as well as the balance to omega-6s, are very, very important as far as supplementation. So when you wrap this up in a nutshell, the major things to take home is when you're trying to prevent cardiovascular death, get your lifestyle in order, number one. That's what you can affect the most. You can't affect your genetics as much. I mean, obviously you can, in fact, when we talk about offsetting your genetics, lifestyle is the main way. There is supplementation that can help, but the main way is through an ideal lifestyle. So we can't always control the toxin load around us, can't control those genetics, like I said, but lifestyle we can control. So making sure that we're exercising, eating real food, like I talked about before, but also managing stress, making sure we're fighting back against the stressful world as much as possible. Then the next thing is make sure you are getting into the weeds on your blood work. Now, a lot of times, and I don't mean this in a bad way, your primary care is not necessarily going to be willing to run all these labs, because for a lot of them, they are kind of stuck to guidelines. They kind of have to do what your insurance is going to cover in a lot of settings. And so, unfortunately, a lot of times, most of the time, your insurance company is not necessarily going to say, oh yeah, let's do all this testing. This would be great. You have to sometimes look outside of that. But there are lots of ways to get labs for cash rates that are very, relatively inexpensive, that are very doable for most people to get this bigger picture on their health. So you might have to ask for that. You might have to, some labs even let you self-order certain labs, or work with a doctor who's a little bit more functional, who's willing to dig into this. But I think if you don't measure it, you don't know how you're managing it. You have to be able to measure it. And then, of course, match that supplementation to hit those weak links to offset those markers that are creating the biggest profile or the biggest risk profile to you. So I hope this helped give you a much clearer picture of what you can do to be much more proactive about your cardiovascular health instead of just looking at cholesterol and taking a statin medication. Don't forget to visit our website at healthytallahassee.com and go ahead and sign up for a free consultation with me if you want to get more into the weeds and talk more about some strategies you can do to really more comprehensively monitor your heart disease risk. And don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube at Neurotrition Podcast. And I look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode.